that the American families are struggling right now with affordability?
Senator, as we discussed in your office, central bankers should not be second guessing what people feel and see in their own lives. People's lived experiences matter to them. What I can say is the central bank has some responsibility for the things that you've described, and that the legacy of inflation, what I think is the biggest economic policy error in 40 or 50 years, happened just a few years ago, and we're still living with the remnants of it. I think inflation is less problematic than it was a couple of years ago, but I would not.
But the problem of affordability continues, though. That sounds right. Because I'll be honest with you. When I hear, I heard 2 months ago President Trump say, he said, quote, "What word have you not heard over the last 2 weeks? Affordability. Because I've won. I've won affordability." It sounds like you would disagree with that assessment that the fight for affordability for American families is over.
So I think the trend is going in the right direction.
But we still have more work to do.
Well, the way I would describe it, Senator, is the cumulative increase in prices starting in early 2020 till now is between 25 and 35%. So I understand what hardworking Americans say. It's still a struggle. That's a legacy of a past policy error.
One thing that you talked about before is about just the real cost that families are facing right now, and I appreciate that you were pushing back on that comment that the president had about calling the energy prices and the fuel price increases that we're having fake inflation, because right now Americans have paid more than $8.4 billion more in gas during the first month of this war. Fertilizer, 70% of respondents to the Farm Bureau survey said that fertilizer is unable to be afforded right now, just given the price increases. Are you concerned that there could be real long-term effects of this war in Iran, especially if we're continuing to see these challenges when it comes to fuel and fertilizer?
Senator, if my reform agenda, if confirmed, stands for anything, it's for the central bank, especially the Fed chairman, to stay in its lane.
I know that, but you also have
want to wander outside of it. I'm happy.
But you're also charged with forecasting in terms of understanding where our economy is going. So does an impact of that magnitude rise to something that the Fed should keep an eye on and be concerned about?
The Fed should have an open mind towards all sorts of data, but the things that central banks can affect are things that are not one-off in nature, but are persistent and find their way into the generalized price level.
And that's something I wanted to ask you about, that because you talked about a fundamental policy change when it comes to the Fed, and I guess I wanted to just get a little bit more clarity on that. Senator Lummis mentioned about the balance sheet and the concern you have about that. What level do you think the balance should be at? If it's $6.7 trillion now, where do you think the goal is in your mind?
So I haven't fixed a particular number, but any changes, Senator, in the balance sheet would be part of a public discussion, debated rigorously. And if and when the central bank comes to a judgment about a new balance sheet policy, which I hope the central bank would, it would be described well in advance. As I mentioned, it took 18 years to create this balance sheet problem, and we won't be able to fix it in 18 minutes. And so that's why I think deliberation here is important. Suffice it to say, it should be smaller, and at least as important, it should not be holding long-term treasury assets as if it's the fiscal authority. That's when it gets into politics.
I appreciate you saying that it's important to be able to have that public discussion. I mean, one thing that's come up as I've been engaged with different experts is concern about rapid reduction. If you are moving in that speed, it could generate a number of concerns, including upward pressure on long-term interest rates. So I guess I just wanted to check, do you share that concern? As you are thinking about how to reduce it, do you also understand, though, that there are concerns about rapid reduction in the speed with which you're trying to go down?
Yes, Senator, and that kind of regime change would have to be deliberate, well orchestrated, well choreographed, and well described, so that unnecessary upset are not done to financial markets as we go to a policy regime change much more focused on interest rates.
With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, sir. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Warsh. It was great to see you in my office. Thanks for coming by. I want to continue to talk about inflation because it is something that is incredibly important. I think you share the view that inflation is a silent tax on American households. Is that accurate?
Senator, it's accurate. It's the most regressive tax that anyone in Washington could come up with. If you were trying to do the most harm to the least well-off among us, inflation would be the way to do it.
Yeah, and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have been talking about that. And I note, at least I don't recall, that they ever talked about that during the Biden administration. Because it was during the Biden administration that we saw this record inflation, this 40-year-old high inflation. And yet my Democrat colleagues were silent about it back then. Now they want to talk about it. But of course, American households were hurting back then as well. Inflation was caused by President Biden's reckless policies and reckless spending. Let's look at ARPA, a partisan bill that was passed by the Democrats, which cost taxpayers $1.9 trillion. When ARPA was passed in March of 2021, inflation was at 2.6%. Inflation quickly accelerated. It was over 5% by May, June, and July. By the end of the year, December, it was 7%. Does federal government spending have anything to do with inflation, Mr. Warsh?
Senator, as we talked about in your office, my view of